Uh, I read a report from an economist, and it was quite interesting. What he was looking at the same question, and he puts it down to economic growth requiring investment in productivity, which is, of course, as a venture capitalist, what I like to hear. And let's look what's happened to our net investment in productivity enhancing investments. And as it turns out, those peaked at about $500 billion net. And I'll explain net for a second, but $500 billion net investment in tools, equipment, and factories was going on in the US economy up until 2007. Within a year, it had turned to be about 100 billion net. A year later, 2009, it was actually 100 billion minus. And what that means is literally the tools, the equipment, the factories are wearing out, and we're not investing them. Now what happened, and it all makes sense now, we had about $500 billion net going into new equipment, not the replacement costs. The replacement investment is 1.1 trillion. So just to keep the factories running, the tools from wearing out, cars keep moving in the factories, that takes 1.1 trillion. You need another 500 billion just to keep productivity growing. So what happened was that stopped, 500 billion disappeared, and that's when we had the stimulus plan, which on that kind of level might have made sense. Hey, we're going to put $700 billion to replace the fact that the corporations have taken out 500 billion. Of course, if Michael Robertson were here, he would have said that 700 billion was probably not used very well. In fact, it wasn't even 700. It wound up being about 450 billion in shovel-ready projects. Those shovel-ready projects, we all know, got criticized because they weren't actually things that boosted productivity. But now it's starting to be more and more clear to me. You had 500 billion in corporate investment, which, by the way, has stringent ROI return requirements, as we all know. If anyone here is in a corporation and tries to get someone to approve a new investment, it takes a lot of work. Versus the government investment. Government investment, was probably worth 10% of the corporate investment, maybe less. Again, channeling Michael Robertson, he might say absolutely zero. But the real key here is this. The US government had a one-time kind of espresso shot. We're going to put in 500 or 700 billion of investment to offset the fact that corporations have disappeared in doing that. But that was a one-time shot. Whereas the US economy was putting out $500 billion of investment in factories, in tools, in equipment, and that's all disappeared. So what happened in 2010? It was negative, meaning we actually depreciated more than we invested in 2009. 2010, it was about 150 billion, so about, 30% of what it was. And I think the real question is what's going to happen in 2011? Now, if it comes back to 500 billion, I actually think then you'll see a lot of jobs getting created. But if it stays where it is, it won't. And this is the reason why politically it makes a lot of sense to get that money out of those corporations. There's this mythical 2 billion of cash held by corporations. It's probably not really 2 billion. But if we could get corporations to have a better ROI on that money that they were putting to work before, they'd invest it. And I think what we have to do is we may not like it, but we have to say, all right, you get a investment tax credit. For every dollar that you invest in those things, you get 50 cents of tax rebate, whatever it is. Because we know 2 or 3 extra jobs are created when we do that. And then the next thing we need to do, of course, is we probably need to have these factories and workers get retrained. And that's maybe where the government has a bigger role. So anyway, the reason I mentioned this was because I've been struggling with the same question that everyone else reads in the media, which is why consumer spending is back, and yet the economy is adding no new jobs. So maybe that's the reason, and if it is, things like technology investment, I think, are going to go a long way towards bringing back those jobs. Couple of other things here. Forget about the economy for a second. Let's talk about the stock market. Now that we have all these social media tools, it's really a lot easier to track what people said and when they said it. One of the things that the media did in the 2008 crash is they went back and they said, did anybody predict this? And there's been a few people who did or who said pretty prescient things. I want to read you a quote here from Jeremy Grantham, who is a manager of about a $100 billion bond portfolio, a long time, very, very prescient investor. I want to read it to you for two reasons. First, I think this provides a lot of credibility. In April 2007, this is what he said. The first truly global bubble, from Indian antiquities to modern Chinese art, from land in Panama to Mayfair, from forestry infrastructure and the junkiest bonds to mundane blue chip stock, it's bubble time. Everyone everywhere is reinforcing one another. Bursting of the bubble will be across all countries and all asset classes, and no similar event has occurred before. And he said that in April 2007.
Wow.
And this is a guy who, not as well known as Warren Buffett, but among bond investors, he is considered to be probably the greatest global macro investor. I mention him because I've been now following him on my Google alerts, thinking, all right, this guy did predict a pretty important bubble bursting.
Can you say his name again?
Jeremy Grantham. And someone asked him today, so the US stock market, how is it doing? And he said, well, the S&P 500, I think is going to rise to about 1,500. It's at 1,300 today. By the way, that's double from what it was at the bottom, March 2009. Went from 600 to 1,300. He thinks it's going to 1,500, but he said, that's just because people are excited. The value of the S&P 500 is 910. Wow. That's a pretty big decrease. The other great investor, who's actually a local guy, Jeffrey Gundlach, I don't know if any of you ever heard of him. He ran TCW's, which is a giant mega fund here in LA. Like, they manage about $1 trillion. He ran their bond portfolio for 20 years. Actually, a better return than Bill Gross, the quote junk bond maven down in Orange County. Not my partner, Bill Gross.
PIMCO.
Yeah, from PIMCO. So Jeffrey, he left TCW, he set up his own bond shop. Really credible guy. The quote I got from him was, S&P is at 1,300, and he thinks it will go to 500. Now, both of those guys have great track records. I personally find it hard to believe that'll happen, but then again, I found it hard to believe that the whole housing market would collapse. Gundlach also believes that housing will fall another 10 to 15%, which is interesting when you consider that from 2005 to 2008, all the people who had mortgages from that period, 40% of them are underwater already.
Wow. So
if the market drops another 15%, you get up to about 65% of all those people underwater. That looks really, really bad. But you have to believe that's the case. And there are, by the way, I haven't mentioned all the people who are saying the trees are going to the sky. I don't think things are going to be wonderful this year, but I just have a hard time seeing, with all the investment going in to the market, that we're going to see prices drop that much. A couple of other things now I'd like to talk about on the company stuff. Some of these, Ken, you had mentioned to me. But first, of course, all these digital companies we've been talking about continue to grow really, really quickly. Priceline, what, near $500 a share now. And you really look at it, it's all the distribution companies, right? From Expedia to Netflix, Priceline, companies that are just providing access from a consumer to some sort of product. They're the ones who are seeing, and I guess you could put Amazon in that category too. They don't really make anything, they just sell it. This age is all about distribution and capturing it. A lot of stuff on Metal this past week about Amazon Prime. The only thing I'll say is it's about frickin' time. Netflix is on its 20 millionth subscriber.
Yeah, real quick, I want to ask Larry, since you're here, do you think from what you saw initially out of Amazon Prime, do you see it as real competition against Netflix?
We'd have to find what real competition is.
Well,
does it slow down Netflix's growth? Mm-hmm. Yes, just because Amazon at least has the potential to put huge marketing muscle behind it. I think their customer base is, and unlike a lot of other sites, they have a real relationship with customers. I think that's pretty powerful.
And it's on a bunch of different devices, Roku, we see it, Google TV, which is good, but not the same distribution as Netflix yet. But they can get it because they have fairly quick acceleration, right?
Well, the point I made in my little missive is that competing in the pay TV window.
Right.
We have never had more than 35 million pay TV subscribers in this country, with a total of probably 50 million subscribers. Some households take more than one.
Got it.
Who these guys are really competing with increasingly are actually HBO, Showtime, Stars, and Epix. And if anybody's under attack, it's actually those services.
It's
because there's a finite, I believe there's a finite amount of discretionary subscription money for that class of product.
Yeah.
So we'll see some eroding of that, is what you're saying, is when it comes to premium subscriptions.
Correct. They don't have to. It's not Netflix